Oh.
So it's the second line under the Legal Aid Amendment Regulations 2021, dated November 23, 2021.
Noted. Any other
corrections on the
corrections?
on the 2 o'clock meeting?
No.
I think
3?
the 2 o'clock, the first one.
Oh.
I think Member Henry actually chaired the meeting. You have him as absent.
No, he wasn't.
No, he started and then.
No, that's not the minute. It's the very first. Remember, we had 2 meetings.
We had 2
that
meetings.
Day. He wasn't at that meeting.
Wasn't that the first one?
No.
And handover?
No.
Okay.
If going back through the Hansard, you'll actually see where they say there was an apology for the chairman. It was in November 6th.
In that same room?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just asking for the, having gone through the corrections, I'm asking now for the confirmation.
So moved, Chair.
Moved and seconded. Okay, thank you very much. Right, we asking for the confirmation for both minutes.
So moved, Chair.
Thank you very much. Yes, as I've outlined already, the purpose of this meeting, and therefore we have with us the officers from the Ministry of Science, Energy and Technology. So we just ask that they be invited in. Want to take this opportunity to welcome the officers from the Ministry of Science, Energy and Technology, and just to ask, okay, we have the, okay. All right, we just ask for a brief overview of the matter that we are considering today.
Good afternoon, Chair. Good afternoon, members. My name is Joaquin Morian, Chief Technical Director in the Ministry of Science, Energy and Technology, and I have colleagues from the Spectrum Management Authority, Mr. Malcolm, Mrs. Wood, and a colleague from the Ministry as well, Ms. Campbell, who's a Senior Legal Officer. The matter for consideration of the Regulation Committee is, or pertains to amendments to the regulations pursuant to the Radio and Telegraph Control Act. The MSET, in seeking to maximize the use of radio frequency spectrum, would have spent some time reviewing the current spectrum fee framework, and we would have engaged in that regard an ICT consultant or support from the ITU to undertake that review. Subsequent to that review, which showed that our mechanisms were dated for fee pricing was dated, and that there were fees that were applied to certain bands that several years ago, which required updating in keeping with international good practice. Subsequent to that review, the Spectrum Management Authority would have undertaken a more detailed review, engaging a consultant to support it in determining what those fees or new fees would look like. And once that consultation was concluded, the ministry, along with in collaboration with the SMA, would have spent some time developing a spectrum pricing policy and framework, which we took to Cabinet in March of last year and would have received approval in relation to. In order to give effect to the fees, it requires not only administrative changes or adjustments, but also regulatory changes. And so to give effect to the policy, what we had to do was to review the fees that would have been outlined in the various pieces of regulations which have been tabled before the committee. So that the regulations which you have before you are in relation to and I won't read the entire name, the citizen band radio service, the amateur radio service, radio operators and technicians, as well as the maritime mobile radio service and the private radio service. All of those pieces of regulations required amendment to update the fees and other matters in relation to the pricing policy which was approved by Cabinet. So primarily that's why we're here, to have those fees approved, one. And additionally, one of the things that we did while looking at the regulations was to take cognizance of the penalties. We know that the government of Jamaica has been on a drive to update the penalties related to some of the offenses in various pieces of legislation. In September of last year, we would have gone to Cabinet seeking approval for changes to be made to the penalties and custodial sentences in primary legislation, which the ministry has portfolio responsibility for. And we took the opportunity, having received that approval in September, to look at the regulations that we have before us and to amend penalties in relation to that. So as the members go through the regulation, they'll notice that we're making some changes to the penalties in the regulations. I don't know, Chair, if you want me to take you through the amendments that are being proposed, or if I can pause there for questions, if there are any.
I know it was circulated earlier to members. I don't know if members would have gotten enough time, or you're satisfied with the briefing from the ministry. So when I look at the issues and the matters that are before us, I see that they were quite appropriate and timely. So for my part, I'm reasonably satisfied. I don't know if the members of the community has any questions or observation to make.
Chair, so I
Yes.
went through all 5 amendments as well. Personally, I have no issues with them because, I don't think there is in any way anything to dispute. But I'm wondering, maybe for the purpose of the record, they could probably just highlight what the changes are. I'm not sure if that would make sense.
Repeat.
Maybe they could just highlight what the main changes, the main differences are for the record. Yeah.
You get that? Okay. All right.
I'm
So
prepared to
please
do that, Chairman, members. Thank you. All right. So with respect to the amendments that are proposed, The monetary penalties, custodial sentences were increased in all the regulations before you. The increases were determined having considered other pieces of legislation treating with similar subject matters. So, for example, a failure to hold a license and breach of secrecy obligations. We would have looked at existing legislation and tried to mirror the fines and or terms of imprisonment in relation to those.
Could you just outline what those conditions were before and what is the adjustment in terms of comparison?
I will do that, member. I'm just giving an overview to just set the tone for where I'm going to go next. And of course, the overall objective being to deter unauthorized use of the spectrum. I think members would appreciate that if there is unauthorized use of the spectrum, then it affects other spectrum users, for example, our telecommunication providers, and interference we know can have challenges for quality of service. So I'll take you now through the individual regs, and I'll start with the Radio and Telegraph Control Citizens Band Radio Service Amendment Regulations of 2022. So Regulation 3, paragraph 2, subparagraph 2 rather, provides that a person who establishes, maintains, or uses a station for operation of a citizen band radio service without a license, without a valid license, shall be guilty of an offense and liable to a fine not exceeding $1,000 and 3 months. The increase in the regulation is to $1 million and 12 months, and the new penalty was determined having regard to the value of the license and the technical capabilities of spectrum used for the service. Regulation 4 of that regulation was also amended to increase the validity period of the license from 1 year to 5 years. It was determined that given the value of the license, the purpose for which the spectrum is used, and the regulatory effort involved in issuing an annual license, it would be more efficient to grant a longer validity, a longer tenure, period of time for the licenses. So we increased the license term from 1 year to 5 years. With respect to Regulation 13.2, that provides that a person failing or refusing to produce an appropriate license within 3 days shall be guilty of an offense and liable to a fine not exceeding $500 and 3 months. That's the current fine and term of imprisonment. And we propose an increase to $20,000 and 3 months, and a period not exceeding 3 months. Well, that remains. We would have looked at similar legislation, for example, the Road Traffic Act, which speaks to when a citizen is asked to present their driver's license and that. So we kept it along a similar line in terms of the fines, increasing it from $500 to $20,000. Regulation 14.2 provides that any person who fails to comply with Regulation 14.1, which treats with obligation of secrecy, they shall be guilty of an offense and liable to a fine not exceeding $1,000 and 3 months. We have proposed an increase to $5 million, and it might seem a lot, but when we considered the need for privacy and the greater emphasis on privacy in recent legislation to include the Data Protection Act, for example, we thought it prudent to keep these along the same line. Additionally, as I indicated, Cabinet would have approved proposed amendments to primary legislation within the ministry's portfolio that also has secrecy and confidentiality provisions. And we propose to Cabinet that those be increased to $5 million and 5 years. So for consistency across the pieces of legislation, we are proposing that the regulations be amended along the same line, because it's the same, essentially the same type of offense, treating with secrecy and confidentiality. Bearing in mind that what can happen in instances like this when you're using the spectrum, and my colleagues can bear me out, is that you can intercept or hear other people's conversation. If you're ever in a taxi, for example, you hear everybody's conversation sometimes, and we're saying that information that you may overhear or come into your knowledge should be kept secret because it might be somebody's proprietary information, you know. So we've kept their fines extremely high, or we're proposing its increase to $5 million to ensure that persons treat with matter that that might come into their knowledge in confidence. Regulation 28 provides that any person who contravenes the provisions of these regulations shall be guilty of an offense and liable to a fine not exceeding $500 or to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 3 months. And we're proposing an amendment to $1 million and 12 months. This is a catch-all regulation and intended to capture any unspecified breaches. So if there's a breach of the regulations which was not specifically identified as an offense, then that person who is charged would fall within the ambit of Regulation 28. With respect to the second schedule, we amended that to reflect an increase in the substitute license fee from $100 to $600, and the imposition of a processing fee of $1,000. I'll now take the members to the radio and telegraph.
Before you continue.
Just a moment.
Sure.
Yes, yes,
So I do appreciate the amendments to 14.2, where data protection is concerned. I think that's very important. But you referenced a while ago being a taxi and overhearing conversations, and it just dawned on me that maybe, I'm not sure the public awareness that will take place around these new measures, these new penalties, so that people are aware that, you know, this is coming and how important it is. Because if not, yeah, we would have some kind of dissonance. Yeah.
Understood, member, and the point is taken, and the authority will engage the licensees on what the requirements are and sensitize them as to how it is that they need to treat with their use and the use. Well, through the wider public, but because these regulations relate to persons who are licensed, and the breach is really in respect of those licensees, right? But I take your point about privacy, and that's something that, on a separate note, we'll treat with, and the government will treat with generally, through the Information Commissioner, who is now on board and will deal with the matters pertaining to the Data Protection Act. But your point is taken, member. Thank you. So I'll take the members now to the Radio and Telegraph Control Amateur Radio Service Amendment Regulations of 2022. Regulation 2A is a new regulation, which is consistent with provisions in the other regulations made pursuant to the Radio and Telegraph Control Act. It provides for the imposition of a penalty for the establishment, maintenance, or use of a station without a valid license. On review of the regulations, we realized that some of the regulations had a specific provision which made it an offense to establish, maintain, or use a station without a license. But in some regulation, that provision was absent. So for consistency across the regulations, we decided that this provision needed to be introduced in this particular one, amateur radio service. And the offense would now bring with it a fine not exceeding $1 million or a term of imprisonment not exceeding 12 months. And we would have determined the penalty based on the value of the license and the technical capabilities of the spectrum used for the service. With respect to Regulation 3, this was amended to increase the validity period of the license from 1 year to 5 years for the reasons I had indicated before: the value of the license, the purpose for which it was used, and the regulatory effort involved in issuing an annual license vis-a-vis a longer term license. So we thought that with that increase from 1 to 5, it would make it more efficient for the regulator to manage these licenses. Regulation 21 is a similar regulation to the one that we looked at before, relating to persons failing or refusing to produce an appropriate license within 7 days. An offense is created in that instance, and the current fine is $50 and 3 months. We're proposing an increase to $100,000 and 3 months. And while before, in the previous regulation, we spoke about $20,000, this one was made a little bit higher because the users of the spectrum in this band are amateur radio service. In amateur radio service bands are hobbyists. So you may have a situation where you have multiple persons using the spectrum, and if they're not licensed, then they can cause interference. So for that purpose, we wanted to send a strong message that persons are not to use the spectrum for amateur radio purposes without being licensed because of the inherent challenges that they may cause in terms of interference. So that is why we've set the this particular offense in respect of not having a license a little bit higher than the ones before. Regulation 33 is the same catch-all regulation as we've looked at before, increasing the fine from $100 and the term of imprisonment from 3 months to $1 million and 12 months. Again, treating with breaches of the regulation that are not now specified as a breach or as an offense. And with respect to the schedule was amended to reflect an increase in the license fee from $300 to $500 per year, an increase in the alien amateur radio station permit fee from 300 Jamaican dollars to US $20, an increase in substitute or replacement license or permits fee from 100 to 500, and the imposition of a processing fee of $1,000. Chair, if there are no questions on that regulations, I'll then move to the Maritime Mobile Radio Service regulations. And Regulation 3.2 was amended to provide for 3 different tenures of a license. That is 1 year for local vessels and 6 months and 4 years for international ships. We note that applications on behalf of the international ships are made through the Jamaica Ship Registry, which is administered by the Maritime Authority of Jamaica. And the MAJ, pursuant to the Shipping Act, requires provisional registration of a ship and thereafter permanent registration. So the amendment in respect of the tenure of the spectrum licenses for these vessels have been tailored to treat with that those administrative matters. However, you'll note that Jamaican ships are not eligible for a provisional license, and they may only apply for the grant of a 1-year license. So that's the amendment in respect of the tenure, 6 months and 4 years for international ships. Regulation 37 and 38 in the primary regulations refer to the Jamaica International Telecommunication Limited, that's Jamintel. And those of us who remember what Jamintel is and know that has not existed for a long time. So that organization, that company has been not in operation forever, for quite some time. And so we amended that to delete the reference to Jamintel and to just indicate that a licensee who operates in contravention of a spectrum license that may have an effect on any other telecommunication licensee would create an offense and is liable. And that fine is $3 million or 3 years. And then Regulation 35, again, the catch-all regulation intended to capture any unspecified breaches. We've increased that from $100 and 3 months to $1 million and 12 months. And then in the first schedule, that has been amended to include a fee for the provisional 6-month license that we spoke about and the 4-year license for international vessels. And those amounts are US $70 for the provisional 6-month license and US $280 for the 4-year license. And then moving to the penultimate regulations, the radio operators and technicians regulations. Again, regulations 30 is a catch-all regulation. For consistency, that has also been increased from $1,000 and 12 months imprisonment to $1 million and 12 months. And then in respect of the fees, the first schedule was amended to reflect an increase in the radio operator certificates, specifically E, H, I, and J. E, the general operator certificate, was increased from $1,000 to $2,000, and the amateur radio operator certificate classes A through to C were increased from $500 to $2,500. My apologies. And then finally, with respect to fees in that schedule, the radio technician's license, class A, was increased from $1,200 to $2,000, and class B from $800 to $1,200. And then the final regs, the private radio service regulations, 2022. Regulation 2A is a new regulation, again, introduced for purposes of consistency in all the regulations. So regulation 2A provides for the imposition of a penalty for the establishment, maintenance, or use of a station without a valid license. And the fine for that is $3 million, and the term of imprisonment is not exceeding 3 years. Regulation 3 was amended to provide for additional periods of validity to cater to all the categories of services which are captured under the heading of private radio, in particular backhaul spectrum, which supports mobile services. As a result of the new periods of validity, it was also necessary to make amendments to reflect that the fees for our licenses are payable annually. So that notwithstanding that the license term could be 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, the fees were to be paid annually over the period of the license. And failure to pay the license fee annually, of course, would result in the license being invalid. Of course, these are larger amounts of money, and so they're larger amounts of money, so it's just prorated over the period of the license. Right, so certainly for their cash flow, I would say.
Well, not really. I mean, I was wondering, what if a licensee wants to pay everything at once? Are they prohibited?
With respect, because the type of license, like for backhaul, it's not that it is paid, it's annualized, meaning the amount that you pay for the 15 years remains the same for 15 years. Right, but how it was said before is that it's prorated, or they pay some and the balance over time. It's the same amount each year.
I understand that, but I wanted to know because it stipulates that they must pay annually. So I'm wondering if a licensee decides to pay. I mean, granted, you're saying it's a huge sum. What if a licensee wants to pay all at once? Are they prohibited from doing that?
Believe me, they can't pay all at once.
Okay, I see. It's that much.
It's that much.
All right.
Right. Yes, some of the spectrum fees can run
Yeah.
Hundreds of millions of dollars. So what we have now are, as I said before, you know, an ability for them to have 10, 15, and 5, 10, 15-year licenses, and they're required to annually pay. With respect to Regulation 17, again, this is one that is similar to others that we have looked at in respect to the failing or refusing to produce an appropriate license, and that we increased from $50 and 3 months to $100,000 and 3 months. Again, for this particular regulation, we had to look at the technical capabilities of the spectrum and the need to deter illegal use of the spectrum as well. And then Regulation 18.3, treating with the obligation in respect of secrecy, we, as discussed before, increased that from $1,000 and 6 months to $5 million and 5 years. And then Regulation 33 permits the grant of a license for periods shorter than a year and for the payment of prorated fees accordingly. And then finally, the first schedule. Members would notice that the first schedule, well, for ease for the drafting, we thought it was more prudent to just repeal and replace the first schedule rather than having amendments to it. So even though the entire schedule is reflected there, not everything was amended. So I'll take you to what was amended. So the new fees for several categories of licenses are as follows. Non-commercial broadcast, that was decreased from $30,000 to $25,000. Aeronautical mobile aircraft station was increased from $5,000 to $30,000, and aeronautical ground station was increased from $10,000 to $40,000. There was a decrease for aeronautical special ground station licenses from $1 million to $10,000. And then emergency earth stations was increased from $5,000 to $50,000, and commercial earth stations, as well as let me treat with them separately. Commercial earth station was decreased from $1 million to $500,000, and VSAT multi-use licenses were decreased from $500,000 to $200,000 for direct to business and $150,000 for direct to home. New algorithms were introduced in relation to point-to-point microwave links, point-to-multipoint microwave links, and duplex pair, and point-to-multipoint microwave links. And those appear at I1, G, H, and I. And then finally, new fees and algorithms for new service types were introduced for low-power FM broadcasting, and that's at 112, Roman numeral 1012, and the mobile subscriber TV services at Roman numeral 113. And that's it, Chair members.
My last question.
Just have one observation. Well, I can understand the reason for the various increases, both in fees and penalties. I don't know if you could explain why there's a decrease. So maybe you could enlighten us as to.
I'll yield to one of my colleagues from the SMA.
Okay, thank you for that question, Chairman. And if I would just generally to explain that oftentimes within the wireless industry, based on technology and the uses of the particular spectrum, the price of the spectrum can actually go up or it goes down. Now, what we have seen over the years, and I give an example, for 1900 spectrum, with which in 2000, when there was an initial auction, 1900 spectrum was priced at 45 million US dollars. Now, at that point in time, that spectrum, there was much equipment available at that time, and also the technology of the day utilized the 1900. Now, with the passage of time and with technological development, the 1900 was no longer the spectrum to use, and so it lost its value because it's based on a demand and supply at times. And so this is why we would have situations with which there are increases in fees and reduction. Thank you, Chair.
Member Davis.
Thank you, Chair. At the outset, you had said that the penalties were to act as a deterrent. I just wondered, how often do we detect breaches?
Well, within the SMA, we have what is called a monitoring and inspection unit. So our core function is to continuously monitor. So we do have at present 14 monitoring sites. There are remote locations, and we can also say from within the office to monitor the spectrum to see where their use is outside of licensed users versus those who are unlicensed and using the band. So we do have almost every month we do have persons who we find in breach, whether with which most often than not it's a radio operator who is found to be in breach, meaning they are not licensed by the Broadcasting Commission and subsequently authorized by the SMA. Those are the number one breaches that we do have, but we monitor every day.
Yes. One last question. When was the last time there was an amendment in terms of adjustment?
So the last set of amendments were actually in 1998
98.
to the fees.
Okay.
So these
20 years.
would have been, yes.
Okay. Buzz, any further question, observation? Okay. Just want to ask members if they're seeing that there's no further question or observations, we want to take from you your confirmation that there is there's no objection.
No objection.
Thank you very much, members. Thank you, NSET, for your presence here today. And as I close, I wish you a safe journey.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, members.
Thank you. There's a move for the adjournment.
So move.
This meeting now stands adjourned. Thank you again.
Thank you.